Steal away to Jesus, steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
Welcome to Clinton Church Restoration's online community read of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. The mission of Clinton Church Restoration is to create an African American heritage site and cultural center at the historic Clinton AME Zion Church in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where W.E.B. Du Bois was born and raised. As a cultural hub inspired by Du Bois's work as a seminal writer, scholar, and activist, this new center will use interpretive exhibits and contemporary programming to explore his complex life and legacy, celebrate the work of this Freedom Church, and share hidden and untold stories of African American life in rural New England. Our 14-week community read of The Souls of Black Folk will be moderated by Dr. Francis Jones-Sneed, historian, board member, and chair of our Scholars Council. Each week she will be joined by a guest scholar for a presentation of a single chapter of Du Bois's classic text, followed by a discussion with the audience. If you are joining us live, we invite and appreciate your participation. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. For best results, we recommend you have the most recent version of the Zoom app downloaded on your device. Attendees watching via a browser may not have all the interactive features available. To see the full schedule for this community read or to learn more about the project, please visit our website at clintonchurchrestoration.org. Thanks for joining us.
Jesus, steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
And welcome to our 10th session of the community read of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. We are pleased to have with us this evening Dr. Reginald Hildebrand. Dr. Hildebrand is an author and retired professor of African American Studies and History. He is currently working on a project called Engaging Blackness, Body, Mind, and Spirit, The Perspectives of Malcolm X, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Howard Thurman. We will begin our conversation with remarks from Dr. Hildebrand, followed by questions from you. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time. Welcome, Dr. Hildebrand. We are very pleased to have you with us.
And I am very glad to be here, Dr. Jones-Sneed. Thank you so much for the invitation. I regret that Dr. Allen could not be here, but I'm very happy to be able to step in for him. And to be part of this Clinton Church Restoration project. I had forgotten, but I took a look at David Levering Lewis's book, and he mentioned something that I had forgotten, that the church, the Clinton Church, was actually very important to Du Bois when he was in Great Barrington, an important part of his life. And this restoration makes as a perfect place for a memorial and a museum and all the projects that you are going forward with. So I'm glad to be part of this. On February 23rd, 1868, when Du Bois was born, the Civil War was not quite 3 years past and was still too close to be history. The war had preserved the Union and wrought many political, social, and economic changes of great importance. But nothing as profound, as inspiring, as daunting, as challenging, as full of potential and fraught with disaster as emancipation and the ongoing struggle to define, secure, expand, and defend freedom for the people who had been slaves and their descendants. If you were a Black person in the South or the North, whether your parents and grandparents were enslaved or not, that struggle for the meaning of freedom possessed you, claimed you when you were born, and how you dealt with it and how it dealt with you would have a huge impact on the quality and trajectory of your life. When Du Bois was born, the vast majority of Black adults had grown up in states that had made it illegal for them to even know how to read and write. Black literacy had been punishable by law for as far back as people could remember. And yet, by the time he entered young manhood, Dr. Du Bois had secured one of the finest and most extensive educations that was available to anyone of any race. Dr. Du Bois became the intellectual Prometheus of the Black people. He captured the fire and power and the perspective of a broad, deep, rigorous education and put it all into service for the struggle for a fuller freedom. He must have been keenly aware that he was a member of the first generation to be born after slavery had ended. If he had only written his powerful, penetrating, and eloquent collection of essays called The Souls of Black Folk, or had only published his historical magnum opus, Black Reconstruction, if he had just organized the Niagara movement and the Pan-African conferences and helped found the NAACP, if his sole accomplishment had been just being the crusading founding editor of the Crisis magazine, or if he had done no more than help lay the foundation for the field of sociology in the United States, or if he had only laid out the methodology and the blueprint for the field of African American studies, as he did when he taught at Atlanta University, any one of those accomplishments would have put Dr. Du Bois in a class by himself. But he did all of those things and much more. I am, and I believe we all should be, in awe of Dr. Du Bois. If someone told me that we are sending you to teach a course on African American history in Turkestan, but you have to leave right now and you can only take one book, grab it and let's go, I would have no problem deciding what book I would take. The Souls of Black Folk. In my view, the single most important volume on African American studies that has ever been written. In it, Dr. Du Bois offers lyrical meditations on history, politics, leadership, economics, education, religion, and music. He brings his readers to Great Barrington and takes us with him to Georgia and East Tennessee. He acquaints us with Greek myths, with sharecroppers, and with spirituals. He offers a balanced critique of Booker T. Washington and poignantly urges us to know Alexander Crummell. Souls is fact and fiction. It is poetry and sociology. It is depressing and inspiring. It is distressing and beautiful. At the beginning of the 20th century, and just 40 years after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Du Bois thoughtfully, carefully, lovingly, and critically measured and meditated on the state of Black America. There is a passage in chapter 6 that explains, I think, what he was trying to accomplish with this book. He wrote, "Herein, the longing of Black men must have respect. The rich and bitter depth of their experience, the unknown treasures of their inner life, the strange renderings of nature they have seen may give the world new points of view and make their loving, living, and doing precious to all human hearts. 1903, the year of its publication, was a terrible time. It was a time of public lynchings, disfranchisement, and the imposition of legal segregation. Booker T. Washington ridiculed liberal arts educations for Black youth, and the dignity of Black people was assaulted and lampooned in popular culture. Their intellectual capacity was questioned, and in some quarters, even their humanity was suspect. The hopes and dreams of earlier times were tattered and bloodied and dim. And it is at that moment that this young scholar published a book called The Souls of Black Folk. It was and is a great gift to us. The narrative of Frederick Douglass is a great book. We read it to try to understand what it meant to be a male slave in the Upper South during the antebellum period. But when I read Souls, it helps me understand who I am and how I can think more deeply about the world and the conditions that I have inherited and I'm trying to fathom every day. Thank you, Professor Jones-Sneed, for creating this space and time for us to meditate on this great work and for the great knowledge and insights that you bring to each of these sessions. Chapter 10, The Faith of the Fathers, begins with these words. It was out in the country. Du Bois is reflecting on an experience he had as a young man in the 1880s in the desperately poor hill country of East Tennessee, where he taught school during the summer break from his own studies as a student at Fisk. It was out in the country, far from home. That is, far from where he lived as a student in Nashville, and very, very far from his home in Great Barrington. And just in case we didn't quite yet get what he was trying to tell us, he added, far from my foster home, the log house in the backwoods where he boarded with a family that summer while he taught. It was even far from that. And it was a dark Sunday night. He arrived at the little country church and the revival service began. Soon, the young man from the Berkshires witnessed something he would never forget. He tells us, the gaunt-cheeked brown woman beside me suddenly leaped straight up into the air and shrieked like a lost soul, while round about came wail and groan and outcry, a scene of human passion such as I had never conceived before. Du Bois doesn't describe how he responded at that moment to that situation, what he did or said. What should he do? Should he try to comfort the woman, or would that be exactly the wrong thing to do? Maybe he should have just gotten out of the way, but that might have looked rude and standoffish. There was nothing in his background to prepare him for that moment. But he knew that somehow those people were part of who he was. And somehow that religious culture was a part of a racial legacy that he had to try to understand. And he wanted to try to explain it to us too. So he wrote this chapter. He called it Of the Faith of the Fathers, but that title is misleading. This chapter is not about faith or anything particularly spiritual. It is about religion as a cultural expression and a reflection of racial hopes, hurts, resignation, and radicalism, and about the church as a social institution. But that does not mean that Du Bois did not take the theological and spiritual aspects of Black religion seriously. He did. Symbolically, Souls begins with a chapter called Our Spiritual Strivings. And the last chapter is his moving and soulful meditation on the meaning and message of the spirituals. There is a striking and memorable passage in Black Reconstruction where Du Bois wrote these words: "Foolish talk, all of this you say, of course. And that is because no American now believes in his religion. To him, its facts are mere symbolism, its revelation, vague generalities, its ethics, a matter of carefully balanced gain. But to most of the 4 million Black folk emancipated by civil war, God was real. They knew him. They had met him personally in many a wild orgy of religious frenzy or in the dark stillness of the night. His plan for them was clear. They were to suffer and be degraded, and then, by divine edict, raised to manhood and power. And so on January 1, 1863, he made them free. The magnificent trumpet tones of Hebrew scripture, transmuted and oddly changed, became a strange new gospel. No, Du Bois was not dismissive of the faith of the fathers or of their theology. That just wasn't what he was writing about in this chapter. He tells us that Negro life, as developed up to the time of emancipation, had 3 defining elements: the preacher, the music, and the frenzy. Just personally, I think that his observations remained true, at least through the 1950s. But after the Civil Rights Movement, and even more so as we entered the 21st century, a transition was taking place. In this chapter, originally published in 1900 as a separate article, Du Bois reflects on the development of the Black preacher as a powerful and remarkable religious archetype who was, quote, a leader, a politician, an orator, a boss, an intriguer, and an idealist. The most unique personality developed by the Negro on American soil. Du Bois helps us understand the origins and the significance of the role that was inherited by Martin Luther King and Minister Malcolm X and Adam Clayton Powell. Today, a few Black preachers of megachurches are national celebrities and wield great influence. But it can no longer be assumed that the most dominant, preeminent, and respected and influential leaders in Black communities are preachers. They now share that position with elected Black officials, business leaders, television news personalities, entertainers and athletes, even high-profile academics and public intellectuals. And many of the leaders in all of those categories are women. None of the 3 founders of Black Lives Matter are preachers, and all 3 of them are women. And when Dr. Du Bois refers with reverence to the music of Black religion, he means the spirituals that he believed were beautiful vessels of a sublime theology that revealed the deep humanity and faith and vision, as well as the extraordinary world-class creativity of Black people. In this chapter, he worries that that music was being adulterated even back then by people who, I quote, caught the jingle, but not the music, the body, but not the soul of the Jubilee songs. They were sacred to him. What Dr. Du Bois referred to as the frenzy, being possessed by the Spirit, is a phenomenon I can remember witnessing often when I was a boy in the early 1950s at my father's church in Philadelphia, where most of the members were people who had migrated from the South. That still happens, particularly in Pentecostal churches, but now what people most often think of as the distinguishing characteristic of Black worship is simply a kind of warm, heartfelt, emotional exuberance, not the spirit possession that Du Bois witnessed far out in the country on that dark Sunday night in Tennessee. And in his description of that phenomenon later in the chapter, Du Bois put it in the context of spirit possession in the Bible and in classical Greek culture, and notes that its expression could range in the Black culture from silent, rapt countenance to physical fervor. He does not sneer at it. He may have been overly analytical, but he tried to understand it and to help us understand it as well. After slavery, Du Bois relates that Black religion built church buildings and organizations and denominations and hierarchies, and the church became what he called the social center of Negro life in the United States, the central clubhouse of a community, and in microcosm, all the great world from which the Negro is cut off by color prejudice. Culturally, socially, politically, even economically, the church by default and necessity had to fulfill many roles. To some degree, that is still true, but the civil rights movement did open doors to many areas from which Black people had been excluded. So it seems that Dr. Du Bois has given us a historical perspective on many roles that the church once played during a time when it was assumed that most Black people belonged to church and that they were either Baptists or Methodists. That baseline can help us to begin to better see and grasp the period of transition that we are now passing through. Two brief final reflections on this chapter, and I will be done. Dr. Du Bois makes some sweeping generalizations about the differences between the racial politics of the church in the North and the South. He characterized churches as they developed in the South as being submissive and accommodationist, like Booker T. Washington, and churches in the North as being radical and assertive, like himself. Fortunately, in the next to the last paragraph in the chapter, he draws back from those stereotypes by noting that although he had described two extreme types of ethical attitude, he concluded by explaining that it was actually between those two extremes that, quote, wavers the mass of the millions of Negroes, North and South. So the mass of Black worshipers, as common sense would indicate, North and South were not in either extreme. Finally, after his cultural, social, historical, and anthropological explorations of Black religion, Dr. Du Bois does end in the final paragraph of the chapter by turning to something transcendent, indeed, to the faith of the fathers. He wrote, "But back of this still broods silently the deep religious feeling of the real Negro heart, the stirring, unguided might of powerful human souls. Someday, the awakening will come. 10 million souls shall sweep irresistibly toward the goal. He spells that with a capital G. Out of the valley of the shadow of death. I believe that as he ends this chapter, Dr. Du Bois is telling us that he, like the people of faith who sang their souls in the spirituals, like the spiritual that he begins this chapter with, and that we heard at the beginning of this session, like them, he believed that someday we would steal away, and live free beyond the veil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hildebrand. That was a wonderful presentation on chapter 10. We have a couple of questions so far. And so we'll go to those. Do you think that the lack of influence of the church contributes to the lack of intergenerational movement building within the Black Lives Matters movement?
Oh. Yes. Yeah, and it's good. Du Bois allows us to talk about contemporary events, so I will just for a second hear that. That question is just so interesting, and it's something I've been thinking about actually for some time now. The Black Lives Matter movement, I applaud, and they've got a good spirit, and they're moving in the right direction and trying to correct things that are wrong and heal some things where people have been injured and families, and that's wonderful. And that is prominent here in Durham, where I am. But you mentioned the church, and there is a pastor who serves on the city council who has the kind of intergenerational connections that the question reflects. And it pains him when Black children are killed by gang violence and nobody takes a knee and no celebrity pays for the funeral. And the community does not gather and demand protection for, there are a group of mothers, maybe 12 people, 20 at the most, who demonstrate every Saturday here in Durham. And they have posters of their children, their sons mostly, who have died. And they know that they're out there trying to make the point that these children's lives mattered and that they need the comfort and support that we give when someone is shot in Minneapolis or Ferguson. And I think I am wrapping up, Francis. It is the connection that the church has that connects you with people beyond social media, that your community of empathy are people you interact with who may not be famous and who may not, whose deaths may not fit the important political point that we're trying to make, but morally, spiritually, those lives matter just as much. And I think that part of what has happened when Du Bois was talking about leaders coming from the church, they were leaders because they did not have to be accountable to the white world. They were independent. But because they were preachers, whether they were honest or hook and crook, whatever it was, they had to somehow go through the motions of being accountable to a Black congregation, to a Black community. And unfortunately, if we're at a point where leaders are not in that milieu, but are either graduate students or professors or from an academic background, they do not have to be accountable to a Black community. They may be and are clearly accountable in meaningful, important ways that I respect and admire and am in awe of, accountable to the Black cause. But it allows, the way they are positioned allows them not to be connected to some people in the way that they might have been in the past, where this church-based, as that wonderful question. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, where do you see the divide, though? When did the Black church really fall away as being the most important central kind of place within Black community life?
It was the most central by default. There was no alternative. And once there became alternatives, once you know, in my lifetime, when I can recall people coming to my father when they needed jobs or when they wanted to get out of jail, when they wanted something done in the city government, when they were trying to get a kid in college. This was just the go-to place that if he couldn't get it done, he knew who it could and had that. But now we can do those directly. We have, you know, the chief of police here is a Black woman, and the mayor for many years was a Black man, and you have a number of other places where you can go to directly. So what was unique about the church, for reasons that are unfortunate, was that it concentrated, because there weren't other places to go, both a community that spanned generations, and depending on the church, maybe class as well, yeah. With a leader who had to be conversant with, and to affirm and respect all of them. And once that divides off, it's possible for, and I don't mean to be critical, but it's possible for people who are courageous and well-meaning and intentioned and living and breathing to make life better for Black people, to have no connection to those women who come out every Saturday because their children have been killed and nobody's paying any attention to them or providing them any support.
Yeah. The question really goes to the divide between old heads and new heads.
Yeah.
And so how do we do something about that kind of divide? Because within the traditional Black church, that divide was kind of created over time between, you know, young folks and older folks. But now, because the younger generation are not necessarily church members, there's a kind of divide in, you know, the ministers, say, and leaders of the Black Lives Matters movement. And so it goes by, when somebody older has some kind of opinion from, say, the civil rights movement, they say kind of get over, because that's old school, you know. So
Dr. Jones-Sneed, yeah, go ahead.
So how do we meld that divide between wisdom, you know, the wisdom that we you know, worked for, and then now no one listens to it, kind of.
Well, I'm old enough to remember having said, "Don't trust anybody over 30."
Yeah.
So I'm sympathetic in a sense, and I don't have an answer, but I do have an illustration to the point that you just made. There was a city council meeting that I observed when they were talking about police protection. As I mentioned, the police chief is a Black woman who is very committed to the community in effect, but she's police. So from one point of view, that means she's the enemy. So it was precisely the division that you were talking about. They were older, and by older, I mean in their 40s. People from public housing, been there forever and were involved in every, movement in the community for years, who said, we're at a point where sometimes we have to tell our children to jump in the bathtub until the shooting stops, or we taught them that when they hear shooting outside, hit the ground. If it's inside, get in the tub. And this is just, that we can't go on like this. And what they wanted to work out with the chief of police was to increase police patrols in the areas that were being affected by this, which was just the last thing the Black Lives Matter people wanted to hear. Mm-hmm. And so the division between old heads, as you put it, who weren't that old, but just had a different life experience. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that they were naive about the police or weren't aware that the police could be problematic. In their case, it was compared to what? And if people are shooting in our houses and we're afraid to let our children play outside unless there's a police car on the corner, they say, right now we need this. Yeah. And the Black Lives Matter people were saying, we are not going to allow another police person to be hired. If she needs the money for that, it's not going to happen. In fact, they denied her money to replace tasers. It was just anything for the police was no good. So I'm just agreeing with you, and I don't know the solution, but it requires something that will serve the role that the church did. That is, an organization where people across generations are forced, that's perhaps not a good word, but a climate that encourages people across generations to deal with each other and to respect each other, and praying together doesn't hurt. There you go.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Everett Brinson, a great panelist who's always here for everyone's asked. In this chapter, Du Bois wrote, quote, "The triumph of the lie today with its false culture faces the hideousness of the anarchist assassin," unquote, and later, quote, "The price of culture is a lie," unquote. Can you talk about the lie? Please elaborate.
Oh, that line just jumps out from that chapter. The price of culture is a lie. And the assassin he's talking about is a direct reference to 2 years earlier, 1901, President McKinley had been assassinated by an anarchist. And when he describes what in sweeping terms, too sweeping, the radicalism that developed in the North as people got expectations were raised, but were facing limitations all the same that radicalized them and made them become cynical, bitter, and flirt with chaos or anarchy. The other part of that was when he's talking about people who are making compromises in the South. That was the model he used for that, to get along and to get some safety and some success, some security by deception, by accommodating, by saying things they did not really believe. Both people and both sides are slightly a kilter to what they know to be true or what they're able of comprehending to be true. And Du Bois, this is very important for Du Bois about the truth and integrity. His Trinity, if we talked about his religion, his Trinity is beauty and truth and love, all with capital letters. And he's really, when he's acting as an intellectual and as an educated man, he is really profoundly committed to pursuing truth with a capital T, whoever that makes uncomfortable, whether it's white people or Black people. That's his job. And he wrote an essay, I'm not sure, it was collected in the Education of Black People, about Galileo. And he just condemns Galileo for backing away from his truth, even when his life was at stake. He said, you know, just to live a miserable few years after that, what you gave up the truth. And what he meant was not just giving up some facts, but for him, it was almost like in the same sort of seriousness as Peter denying Christ when he's questioned about it. So all that comes together when Du Bois sees people who are either exceeding what they ought to know is true or pretending things that they know are not true in order to have access. He uses the term culture. I think he means something broader than that, but I don't know that and I shouldn't impose that. But for him, the lie, betraying the truth, is how we got into this mess. And he thinks that people, leaders of the coming generation, have to make a commitment, whatever the cost, to the truth.
Yeah, it would be very interesting, Du Bois's expression and retort to our present president.
Oh, well, I can imagine. he will tell you there's a reason he went to Ghana.
Marissa Mastery asks, she says, thank you so much, Dr. Hildebrand. This analysis has been amazing. Like you mentioned, Du Bois speaks of the quote unquote gospel hymns being ruined and, in your words, alterated. Yeah. Similarly, Du Bois talks about the American Negroes sort of stepping into a religion despite having their own traditions from their native land.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm wondering if you can comment on the impact of the dynamic of both having to, quote unquote, adopt a new religion and then proceedingly having your contributions to that space then be appropriated.
Wow. Well, that's interesting. As he talks about that development, he starts when he's talking about the religion of the people who were slaves, he starts with the African foundation. And he talks about in terms of the foundations for the role of the preacher, the chiefs, and other kinds. So, this chapter is pretty broad in where he looks for the origins of things, and he begins with the development of religion, Black religion in the Caribbean, where African influences in what he refers to as voodoo, and also uses terms like heathen, are much more prominent. But as I read that chapter, as he goes from African traditions to, he says, then there is a veneer of Christianity, but the church wasn't really Christian until over time that developed. And when he talks about, and you'll get to and as you know, in the chapter of the sorrow songs, he traces them to Africa and some phrases in the music from Africa. So there is the view from, I think, a more directly nationalist position, that there is a cultural purity and a contamination or an adulteration that occurs when African religions are what Malcolm would have called the white man's religion. That something of your cultural identity is weakened or dissipated. I don't see that at least in this chapter in Du Bois. He's just describing how things are developing and the impact that they are having. And I think at the end of the day, from my point of view, and I may be just imposing this on Du Bois, and many people listening will know this better than I, but where I think Du Bois is not hostile to Christianity, and he's not particularly hostile to Europe. And so when he is very proud of the African contribution to, and he mentions it in the chapter, says the religion of the South, particularly the religion of the white South, is really influenced by Black religion and Black sensibility. And in pulling those things together, I don't think he says diminishes them, makes them more complex, but it is his intention to hold on with pride the elements and identify the elements that are African, but he is comfortable with the parts that are Christian or European. And to call Christianity European is a misnomer as well, but you understand my point.
Yes. Dr. Dolan Hubbard, who was here last week.
Yes, I heard it.
He's in the audience, and he likes your comments. And he says the moment when then Willie stumbles in is arguably one of the most defining moments in Dr. Du Bois's life. Yet few scholars discuss this keynote moment. And that is when Du Bois, I think, discovers the capacity and the importance of Black religion.
Oh.
And he says he really enjoyed the presentation, look forward to your forthcoming book, and that he has a picture in Salisbury, North Carolina, taken with Howard Thurman.
What?
So you may want to,
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you, Professor Hubbard. Emily.
Well, I enjoyed his presentation, and that he actually met Howard Thurman and has a picture. I am now in awe of him. Yeah.
I figured you would be. Why do you think Reverend William Barber's movement has not garnered as much attention as other current movements?
Oh, I wish I knew. I wish he knew. For reasons that we've talked about, Dr. Jones-Sneed, the path out of where we are is where Barber is leading us. Race is essential to moving forward. But if you do not attack poverty broad-based, and if you don't look at the gap, but the growing gap dangerous gap between the wealthy and the poor that has grown by leaps and bounds since the 1980s, that whoever is lacking in power and wealth, they're going to be living in violence. It's not just Black people, although that's disproportionately, but poor people, whoever they are, get the short end of the stick in education, in the criminal justice system, in medical care. And as that gap grows, the only way that can be maintained is with force, with violence. Yes. And he, I think, understand. We talked about the generational gap and how that we don't have an institution like the church, the role that it played in the past in pulling things together. What he's trying to do at a time when it's not the coolest thing is to have a multiracial movement. Not that Black Lives Matter isn't, it is, but the focus is Black lives, which is good, important, necessary. Barber would not disagree with that at all. But he would say that we're only going to fix this if we deal with poverty, and if we deal with the culture of violence, and the great imbalances in power that have been growing and that have just horrible effect on people's lives. And the problem, you know, he must be in his 40s or maybe 50s. And I'm not sure if that's all that for young people. It's all that, I don't know. I'll stop because I don't know what I'm saying. But he doesn't fit the mold that I think people would like to
hear. It seems he's doing very important work, and somebody in the audience is asking who is Reverend William Barber. They don't know who he is, and so can you talk?
Yes, I'd be glad to. The shorthand answer to that, if there is someone who can legitimately claim to be, he doesn't, but he could claim to be the successor to Martin Luther King in terms of his vision about what should be done and how it should be done and who needs to be involved, who speaks with a kind of moral authority, who is opposed to violence and poverty and war. He was for many years the president of the state chapter of the NAACP here. And that organization grew by leaps and bounds when he was its head. He's now one of the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign. He is quite deliberately picking up with, he said, this is where we fell down. If we don't deal with this, even if we get the race thing right, which not likely either, but if we don't deal with the poverty thing, we're still going to have problems. So he's moving there. He received a MacArthur Award not long ago. He is a powerful orator, and he is just an approachable human being. Yeah. I was out to tell one quick story, and then we can go on. But I'm glad the person asked that. And please look up the Poor People's Campaign and Barber and get involved and help in whatever way you feel inclined to do. There was a little girl, a 1-year-old child, who on Christmas Day in 2015 was shot in the head by a drive-by while she was being held by her mother in her mother's arms outside their apartment in public housing. This is on Christmas Day. And for a time, for the reasons we've already mentioned, it didn't get much of a response. I had students who would fly to Ferguson, but wouldn't walk a 1.5 miles to where this project was to help that family out. And the NAACP took the lead in bringing people together to affirm the value of the life of this baby and to provide support for this family that had undergone this unimaginably horrible experience. And at that point, Barber was no longer president of the NAACP. He'd gone on to what he's doing now, but he came and stood in the back of the church where we were having this meeting. He wasn't on the program, didn't ask to be on the program. He just said, I need to be here to let this family know that this matters to me and they matter to me. And, that's just the kind of person he's the real deal. What he appears to be is what he is. And hopefully we'll figure out how to lift his profile so people will get on board.
Somebody mentioned in the chat that he is part of the inaugural. He has been
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
at the Washington Cathedral, I believe it is.
Excellent,
At
excellent,
Washington National Cathedral tomorrow. So
excellent.
if you don't know who he is and you watch the inaugural, you'll get a chance to kind of hear him. I was going to say that I thought that Barbara's work was a continuation of King's work, the work that
Exactly.
he did not get to do with the Poor People's March, you know.
Exactly.
If one person, JS, asks, if not the Black preacher, who now in 2021 is best suited to serve the Black community and not just the Black cause? Maybe William Barber?
Oh, yeah. Well, he's a Black preacher, though.
Right. Well, I think he's a little more than a Black preacher, though.
Oh,
yes, I believe that. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's the profile, and being a preacher uniquely suits people for the kind of leadership we're talking about, because to one degree or another, they have to stay grounded in the community they serve.
Mm-hmm.
And they also carry with them a set of principles and beliefs, a theology that sort of determines how they engage people and the kind of issues they are required to take on if they have the kind of integrity that Du Bois was talking about. So I agree with you, he fits the profile, but the question suggested that ought to be, where would we look other than preachers? And the question actually is based on reality. The most prominent preachers, as I mentioned in my reflections, are mega preachers and prosperity gospel people, and they are actually very good at being motivational speakers. But that's a whole different category than what we're talking about. So what you hear me is treading water because I don't know the answer to the question.
One person in the chat, and this name just sprang to my brain, Stacey Abrams. Maybe.
Yes. And because she has some of the same characteristics, that is, what was unusual about what happened during the last election was that she was working just as hard as a matter of principle, even though she was not on the ballot. She was not promoting her own cause. She had a set of principles and objectives that were long-term, and she's in it day in and day out. And whether she gets a position or not, her job is to engage a broad race. So that's an excellent suggestion, whoever made it. Yeah. She's someone who will be making a difference as we go, already has, even greater difference going forward.
Yes. Jacqueline Harris says, thank you both so much. This series has been so deeply informative and respect-worthy. Thank you, Jacqueline. What do you think Dr. Du Bois's attitude and understanding was of African religions and life at the time he wrote this particular chapter?
I think it was not nearly as in depth or profound or thoughtful as it would be later in life. I think he had a respectful appreciation, but not a very deep appreciation at this point. So that's as close as I can get to making a critical negative statement about anything that Du Bois did. But he was in 1903, he was beginning his understanding of Africa. He was respectful, but it didn't have much depth at that point.
And it gets follows with Mr. Brinson's questions about Du Bois's analysis and antecedents of Black religion in Africa. And his question is, do you think he gleaned this from research or imagination?
I don't know. I don't know. He probably a little of both. That what this chapter is anyhow is more of um, a meditation than a research paper.
Mhm.
That he has some ideas and some concepts and some information, and he's trying to explain what he sees, but he's not so much doing a rigorous analysis of anything that he's talking about here. He's meditating on it, he's reflecting on it, he's trying to help himself and us understand it. But I would not say that his portrayal of African religion in this chapter is based on extensive research. It sounds more like he did some reading, not rigorous independent research, and try to think his way through what does that mean and how does that fit with what I'm trying to do here.
Yes. Susan Anthos is giving a reminder here that Dr. Barber's the service will be on Thursday at 10 a.m. At the Washington Cathedral, not tomorrow
Not
as
tomorrow.
part of that, but if we're interested, I'm sure it's going to be live streamed for those who want to listen to it. Thank you so much, Dr. Hildebrand. This has been really illuminating, and it's always great to connect back with you in this way. So thank you so much, and especially at the very last minute to step in and do this for us. It's been really great.
My pleasure indeed. Thank you for asking. I enjoyed it.
Oh, great, great. Next week, we will have Dr. Nadine Wedderburn and Dr. Ruby Vega, who will discuss Chapter 11 of the Souls of Black Folk, of the passing of the firstborn. Please stay with us for a beautiful short film about the rich Black history of the area and the work of Clinton Church Restoration.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea.
Hello, I'm Ray Gunn, chairman of the Clinton Church Restoration Project. We are creating a nonprofit center for African American history and culture at the historic Clinton A.M.E. Zion Church in Great Barrington, which I attended for over 70 years. The Berkshires are rich with Black history that is little known and sometimes misunderstood. For example, my ancestor, Agrippa Hull, served in the Revolutionary War and was the largest Black landowner in Stockbridge. Once completed, our center will tell his story and those of W.E.B. Du Bois, Reverend Esther Dozier, and many more. Please help by donating to this historic project. We need your support. Thank you.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, there's no hiding place place down there. Oh, there's no hiding place down there. See, I went to the rock to hide my face. Rock cried out, no hiding place, no hiding place down there. Gonna pitch tent on the old campground. Pitch my tent on the old campground. Gonna pitch my tent on the old campground. Give that devil another round. No hiding place down there. See, there's no hiding place down there. Oh, there's no hiding place down there. See, went to the rock to hide my face. Rock cried out, no hiding place, no hiding place down there. No hiding place down there. Oh, there's no hiding place down there.